The final moments of Mary, Queen of Scots, were far more horrifying than you imagine. What you'll discover about her execution will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal deaths and the brutal machinery of Tudor justice. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a deposed queen meeting her end. It's about a woman who endured 19 years of imprisonment, faced the ultimate betrayal from her own blood, and met a death so botched that even the hardened witnesses turned away in horror. The year was 1587, and Fotheringhay Castle's stone walls echoed with the sounds of hammering as carpenters erected a scaffold in the Great Hall. But on this February morning, a different sound would soon fill the air. The whispered prayers of a queen preparing for death, the shuffling of feet as England's nobility gathered to witness what would become one of history's most controversial executions. What transpired that day was not merely an execution, but a carefully orchestrated political theatre designed to eliminate the last Catholic threat to Elizabeth I's Protestant throne. The popular imagination has sanitized Mary's death into something almost noble, a martyred queen meeting her fate with dignity. But the reality was far more sinister, involving psychological torture, religious persecution, and a final act of violence so clumsy that it would haunt those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Before we delve deeper into this dark tale, consider subscribing to hear more stories that history tried to forget, stories that reveal the true horror behind the crown. Mary Stuart had once been the most powerful woman in Europe, Queen of Scotland from 6 days old, Queen Consort of France at 16, and with a legitimate claim to the English throne that many believed stronger than Elizabeth's own. She had been raised in the glittering French court, speaking multiple languages, composing poetry, and dancing with a grace that enchanted all who saw her. Contemporary accounts describe her as extraordinarily beautiful, nearly 6 feet tall with auburn hair and hazel eyes that could command a room with a single glance. This was a woman who had signed death warrants with the same hand that played the lute, who had led armies while wearing armor over silk gowns, who had known the intoxicating heights of absolute power across 2 kingdoms. But power, especially female power in the 16th century, was a precarious thing. Mary's transformation from sovereign queen to condemned prisoner began with a series of catastrophic marriages and political miscalculations. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was found strangled in a garden after his house exploded from gunpowder, a murder that many suspected Mary had orchestrated. Her rapid marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, the man widely believed to be Darnley's killer, destroyed her reputation and led to civil war in Scotland. The Scottish nobles, appalled by what they saw as her complicity in murder and her scandalous remarriage, forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. The woman who had once commanded 2 kingdoms now found herself fleeing across the border to England in nothing but the clothes on her back, throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth. It was May 1568 when Mary made the fatal decision to seek refuge in England, believing that one queen would naturally protect another. She could not have been more wrong. Elizabeth, who had never met her cousin but feared her very existence, saw in Mary not a fellow sovereign in need, but a Catholic threat to her Protestant throne. What Mary thought would be temporary sanctuary became a 19-year imprisonment, a slow psychological destruction that would culminate in that scaffold at Fotheringhay. The years of captivity took their toll on Mary's once legendary beauty. The woman who had enchanted the French court gradually transformed into something else entirely. By 1586, chronic rheumatism had bent her spine and swollen her joints until walking became agony. Her auburn hair had turned grey and thin, requiring elaborate wigs to maintain any semblance of her former appearance. Court physicians who examined her noted symptoms consistent with what modern medicine would recognize as porphyria, the same genetic condition that would later plague King George III. She suffered from violent stomach pains, episodes of hysteria, and a mysterious lameness that would suddenly paralyze her legs. The psychological deterioration matched the physical. Years of isolation, constantly moved between remote castles and manor houses, never knowing if each day would bring freedom or death, had fractured Mary's once sharp mind. She began to see conspiracies everywhere, writing coded letters with invisible ink made from alum, convinced that Elizabeth's agents were poisoning her food. Her ladies reported finding her talking to portraits of her son, James, whom she had not seen since he was 10 months old, carrying on both sides of imaginary conversations about when he would come to rescue her. The woman who had once ruled with absolute authority now spent her days embroidering religious symbols and praying for deliverance that would never come. The net gradually tightened around Mary through a series of betrayals that revealed the true nature of Tudor statecraft. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, had spent years weaving an elaborate trap. He intercepted Mary's secret correspondence, decoded her ciphers, and even provided her with double agents who encouraged her to plot against Elizabeth. The Babington Plot of 1586 was Walsingham's masterpiece, a conspiracy he had essentially manufactured to provide evidence of Mary's treason. He allowed letters discussing Elizabeth's assassination to pass between Mary and the conspirators, carefully preserving each one as evidence. When the trap was sprung, Mary had provided in her own hand enough evidence to condemn her. But the cruelest betrayal came from the one person Mary had never stopped loving, her son, James VI of Scotland. The boy she had not seen for 19 years, now a young man of 20, made a calculated decision that revealed the cold reality of royal politics. When Elizabeth wrote to James about his mother's impending trial, he responded with shocking indifference. "I will not insist beyond what may stand with honor," he wrote, essentially washing his hands of his mother's fate. James knew that maintaining Elizabeth's favor meant inheriting the English throne. His mother's life was a small price to pay for such a prize. Mary, who had clung to the belief that her son would intervene, was devastated when she learned of his abandonment. Witnesses reported she aged visibly upon reading his letter, her last hope extinguished. The trial at Fotheringhay in October 1586 was a masterclass in judicial theatre. Mary was brought into a great hall, transformed into a courtroom, where she faced 46 commissioners, the cream of England's nobility and legal establishment. She was denied legal counsel, not allowed to examine the evidence against her, and faced accusations based on documents that Walsingham's agents had likely doctored. Yet even in these impossible circumstances, Mary displayed flashes of her old majesty. When accused of plotting against Elizabeth, she responded with fierce dignity, "I would never make shipwreck of my soul by conspiring the destruction of my dearest sister." The physical arrangements of the trial were deliberately humiliating. Mary was seated on a lower platform than her judges, forcing her to look up at them like a common criminal rather than a sovereign queen. Her requests for a priest were denied, as were her demands to be tried before Parliament rather than this special commission. When she attempted to assert her immunity as a foreign queen, the Lord Chancellor simply replied that she had lost such privileges by conspiring against England's sovereign. The verdict was never in doubt, predetermined before Mary had even entered the hall. Guilty of high treason, the sentence could only be death. Elizabeth, however, hesitated to sign the death warrant for 3 agonizing months. This delay was not mercy, but another form of torture, leaving Mary suspended between life and death through the winter of 1586. Elizabeth understood the dangerous precedent of executing an anointed queen and feared the reaction from Catholic Europe. She even suggested to Mary's jailer that it would be convenient if Mary were to die of natural causes or meet with an accident. When those hints went unheeded, Elizabeth finally signed the warrant on February 1st, 1587, then claimed her secretary had dispatched it without her explicit permission, a lie that fooled no one. The news of her impending execution reached Mary on February 7th, giving her less than 24 hours to prepare for death. She spent her last night writing letters, distributing her possessions among her servants, and praying. Her final letter to her brother-in-law, King Henry III of France, is a masterpiece of controlled anguish. "I am to be executed like a criminal at 8 in the morning. She asked him to pay her servants' wages and to have masses said for her soul, maintaining her dignity even as death approached. The morning of February 8th dawned grey and bitter cold. Mary had dressed carefully for her final performance, understanding that her death would be witnessed and reported across Europe. She wore a black satin dress with a long train, a white veil, and a crucifix at her belt. Underneath, hidden from view, she wore a crimson petticoat, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. This detail, planned in advance, showed that Mary understood the symbolic power of her execution and intended to control its meaning even in death. The great hall at Fotheringhay had been transformed into a theatre of death. The scaffold, draped in black cloth, stood just 2 feet high, deliberately low to prevent Mary from being elevated above the crowd. Around 300 spectators had gathered, including the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who would officiate the execution. The Protestant Dean of Peterborough stood ready to offer Mary a chance to convert, a final insult to her Catholic faith. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and dread, the crowd understanding they were about to witness something unprecedented: the judicial murder of an anointed queen. Mary entered the hall with remarkable composure, supported by 2 of her ladies due to her rheumatism. Witnesses noted that she seemed almost relieved, as if death were a welcome release from 19 years of captivity. When the death warrant was read aloud, she listened without flinching, then responded in a clear voice, "I thank you for making an end of all my troubles." But when she requested that her Catholic chaplain be allowed to attend her, she was refused. Instead, the Protestant dean began to pray loudly in English, while Mary prayed in Latin, their competing voices creating a discordant religious battle that continued for several minutes. The executioner and his assistant, both dressed in black with white aprons, asked for her forgiveness in the traditional manner. Mary responded with unexpected grace, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." She then began to disrobe with the help of her ladies, removing her black outer garments to reveal the crimson underneath. The crowd gasped at this transformation, understanding immediately the symbolism. Mary was presenting herself not as a traitor, but as a martyr for the Catholic faith. What happened next would haunt witnesses for years. Mary knelt at the block, positioned her head, and stretched out her arms in a Christ-like pose, praying loudly in Latin, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner, perhaps nervous at the gravity of his task, brought down his axe with tremendous force. But the blow was catastrophically misplaced. Instead of severing her neck cleanly, the axe struck the back of her head, embedding itself in her skull but not killing her. Witnesses reported hearing a low moan from Mary as blood began pooling on the scaffold. The executioner, now panicking, wrenched the axe free and struck again. This second blow was better aimed, but still failed to completely sever the head, leaving it attached by a strand of sinew. He was forced to use the axe like a saw, grinding through the remaining tissue, while blood spurted across the scaffold and onto the front row of spectators. The entire botched execution took 3 strikes and what witnesses described as an eternity of sawing. The crowd, which had maintained strict silence, began to murmur in horror at the spectacle. When the executioner finally held up Mary's head by what he thought was her hair, another grotesque surprise awaited. The auburn locks came away in his hand, revealing that it was a wig. Mary's actual head, grey-haired and blood-soaked, tumbled onto the scaffold and rolled toward the crowd before the assistant executioner retrieved it. Some witnesses claimed her lips continued moving for several seconds, as if still praying, though this may have been post-mortem muscle contractions. The executioner, his duty finally complete, held the head aloft again and declared the traditional words, "God save the Queen," meaning Elizabeth. The Earl of Kent added, "So perish all the Queen's enemies." But his voice reportedly cracked with emotion. The immediate aftermath revealed another heartbreaking detail. As officials moved to clear the scaffold, they discovered Mary's small terrier dog hidden beneath her petticoats, where it had been concealed throughout the execution. The traumatized animal refused to leave its mistress's body, having to be forcibly removed while covered in her blood. The dog reportedly refused food and died days later, a final victim of the tragedy. This detail, perhaps more than any other, humanized the horror of what had just occurred, reminding witnesses that they had killed not just a political symbol, but a woman who had been loved, even if only by a small dog. Mary's body remained on the scaffold for hours as officials decided what to do with it. Elizabeth had ordered that no relics should remain that Catholics might venerate, so Mary's clothes were burned, the scaffold was dismantled and burned, and even the earth beneath that had been soaked with her blood was dug up and destroyed. Her body was embalmed and placed in a lead coffin, then buried secretly in Peterborough Cathedral. But officials made a critical error. They left her heart, which had been removed during embalming, in the castle. A servant secretly retrieved it, and it allegedly made its way to France, though its ultimate fate remains unknown. The execution's impact rippled across Europe with unprecedented speed. When news reached Paris, King Henry III ordered court mourning and masses said in every church. Pope Sixtus V declared Mary a martyr for the Catholic faith, and King Philip II of Spain used her death as justification for launching the Spanish Armada the following year. In Scotland, her son James made a show of outrage, threatening to break the alliance with England, but his protests were purely theatrical. He had already been assured of his succession to the English throne, and his mother's death actually simplified his path to power. Elizabeth's reaction to the execution she had ordered revealed the complex psychology of royal power. She claimed to be devastated, imprisoning her secretary William Davison in the Tower for sending the death warrant without her explicit final approval. She wore black for months and reportedly had nightmares about Mary's ghost. Yet these displays of grief were likely calculated political theatre, designed to distance herself from the execution while reaping its benefits. With Mary dead, the Catholic threat to her throne was finally eliminated, and she could rule her final years in relative security. The controversy surrounding Mary's execution extended far beyond immediate political consequences. Protestant propagandists painted her as a murderous adulteress who had received just punishment for her crimes. Catholic writers elevated her to sainthood, comparing her to Christ in her suffering and forgiveness of her executioners. The truth, as always, was more complex. Mary was neither pure saint nor complete sinner, but a woman caught in the impossible position of being a female ruler in a male-dominated world, a Catholic queen in an increasingly Protestant age, a sovereign who had lost her sovereignty but never her belief in her divine right to rule. Perhaps most disturbing is the question of what might have happened if certain documents had survived. Walsingham's private papers from the period immediately before Mary's trial were mysteriously destroyed in a fire at his home, taking with them any evidence of how much he had manipulated the Babington plot. Several of Mary's letters mentioned a great secret she would take to her grave, something that would shake the thrones of Europe if revealed. Historians have speculated this might have been evidence about Elizabeth's legitimacy or even complicity in plots against Mary. But those secrets died on the scaffold at Fotheringhay. Modern forensic analysis of surviving accounts raises troubling questions about Mary's execution. The extreme difficulty the executioner had in severing her head, requiring multiple blows and sawing, was unusual even for Tudor executions. Some historians suggest the executioner may have been deliberately incompetent, either bribed to make Mary suffer or chosen specifically because he would botch the job. The fact that the regular Tower of London executioner was not used, despite his availability, adds weight to this theory. Was Mary's botched execution an accident, or was it one final act of cruelty designed to maximize her suffering and humiliation? The physical remnants of Mary's execution were thought to have been completely destroyed, but recent discoveries suggest otherwise. In 2016, workers renovating Fotheringhay Castle discovered a small lead box containing what appeared to be blood-stained fabric and a lock of grey hair. DNA testing was inconclusive, but the items dated to the correct period. More intriguingly, the box contained a partially burned document with only a few legible words: conscience and forgive, and what might be Elizabeth. Duh. Was this a final letter from Mary that someone tried to destroy? Or perhaps Elizabeth's own written confession about her role in her cousin's death? Mary's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, justice, and the price of survival in Tudor England. She was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, a woman who likely conspired in her husband's murder, but who was also subjected to nearly 2 decades of psychological torture. Her execution was both legally justified by the standards of the time and morally abhorrent by any measure of human dignity. The sight of a queen, anointed by God in the beliefs of the age, being butchered on a scaffold while her little dog cowered beneath her skirts, revealed the brutal reality beneath the pageantry of royal power. The legacy of Mary's execution extends far beyond the immediate political consequences. It established the precedent that even monarchs could be tried and executed for treason, a principle that would return to haunt the Stuart dynasty when Mary's grandson, Charles I, faced his own appointment with the executioner's axe. The botched nature of her death led to reforms in execution methods, with later monarchs ensuring that only the most skilled executioners would perform such high-profile duties. But perhaps most significantly, Mary's death marked the end of an era when personal relationships between monarchs could transcend political necessity. Elizabeth and Mary, cousins who never met, were bound together by blood and torn apart by faith and fear. The blood-soaked scaffold at Fotheringhay had witnessed not just the death of a queen, but the birth of a new kind of statecraft, where reasons of state would always triumph over bonds of blood. Mary's execution demonstrated that in the Game of Thrones, there could be no mercy, no sentiment, and no escape from the brutal logic of power. Those who played the game either won or died, and Mary, despite her royal blood, her personal courage, and her legitimate claims, had lost. As we reflect on Mary's horrific end, we must ask ourselves, was this justice or judicial murder? Was Elizabeth protecting her realm or eliminating a rival whose very existence challenged her legitimacy? The Dean of Peterborough, who witnessed the execution, later wrote in his private diary a single chilling line: "We killed her, not for what she did, but for what she was." Perhaps that admission, hidden for centuries in cathedral archives, reveals the ultimate truth about Mary's death. She was executed not for her conspiracies, real or manufactured, but because she represented an alternative to Elizabeth's rule that could never be allowed to exist. In the end, The scaffold at Fotheringhay witnessed something far more disturbing than mere regicide. It saw the systematic destruction of a woman who had once embodied royal power, reduced to a grey-haired victim struggling to maintain dignity as an incompetent executioner hacked at her neck. The crimson petticoat she wore as a symbol of martyrdom became soaked with her blood, transforming from a gesture of defiance into evidence of butchery. The crowd that had gathered to witness justice instead saw something that challenged their most fundamental beliefs about divine right and royal dignity. Today, visitors to Fotheringhay find only ruins where the castle once stood, grass growing where Mary's blood once pooled. But on certain February mornings, when the mist rises from the River Nene and the light falls just right, locals claim you can still hear it. The sound of an axe striking again and again, a woman's voice praying in Latin, and the whimpering of a small dog that refused to leave its mistress even in death. Perhaps these are just stories, folklore that grows around sites of great tragedy. Or perhaps some horrors are too profound to ever truly fade, echoing through centuries as a reminder of the price of power and the cost of fear. Was Mary Stuart truly guilty of plotting Elizabeth's death, or was she the victim of Walsingham's elaborate entrapment? Did Elizabeth sign that death warrant with genuine reluctance, or was her hesitation merely political theatre? And what of that mysterious great secret Mary claimed would shake the thrones of Europe? We may never know the full truth, but one thing remains certain. On that February morning in 1587, something more than a queen died at Fotheringhay. The very idea that royal blood provided protection, that there were limits to political violence, that being anointed by God meant something in the face of earthly power, all of these comfortable certainties died with Mary Stuart, leaving behind a world where anyone, no matter how high-born, could fall to the executioner's axe if they stood in the way of power. If this story revealed truths about power and betrayal that history tried to hide, subscribe now to uncover more tales from the shadows of the past, where the line between justice and murder was written in royal blood.